The winds of change are sweeping across the African continent, and at the epicenter of this transformative movement stands a young, visionary leader whose unwavering commitment to authentic sovereignty has sent shockwaves through the corridors of Western power. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso has emerged as the embodiment of a new African consciousness, one that refuses to bow to external pressure and demands genuine self-determination for the continent's 1.4 billion people. When President Donald Trump recently signaled his administration's intentions to reassert American influence across Africa, Traoré's response was swift, calculated, and profoundly strategic. His message was clear. The era of external powers dictating Africa's destiny has reached its twilight. This isn't merely diplomatic posturing or the rhetoric of revolutionary fervor. This represents a fundamental shift in the geopolitical landscape, one that Western powers are struggling to comprehend and adapt to. The significance of Traoré's warning transcends bilateral relations between Burkina Faso and the United States. It symbolizes a continental awakening, a rejection of the paternalistic attitudes that have characterized Africa's relationship with global powers for centuries. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must examine the historical context that has shaped contemporary African geopolitics and recognize why Traoré's stance resonates so powerfully across the continent. Africa's relationship with external powers has been characterized by exploitation disguised as partnership, conditional aid that perpetuates dependency, and military interventions masquerading as humanitarian assistance. The French presence in West Africa, American military bases scattered across the continent, and Chinese infrastructure projects with opaque terms all represent different manifestations of the same fundamental challenge: the struggle for genuine sovereignty in a world where powerful nations view Africa as a theater for their strategic competition rather than a collection of sovereign states with their own legitimate interests. Ibrahim Traoré's rise to prominence occurred during a period of unprecedented youth-driven transformation across Africa. At 34 years old, he represents a generation that has witnessed the failures of traditional governance models and the hollow promises of international partnerships. This generation possesses a sophisticated understanding of global power dynamics, economic exploitation mechanisms, and the subtle ways in which sovereignty can be compromised through seemingly benign agreements and partnerships. The captain's educational background in geology and his military training provide him with a unique perspective on both resource management and security challenges. Unlike many African leaders who ascended to power through political dynasties or external patronage, Traoré's legitimacy derives from his connection to popular movements demanding accountability, transparency, and genuine national development. His criticism of previous administrations' failures and his commitment to addressing the concerns of ordinary Burkinabe citizens demonstrate a leadership style rooted in authentic representation rather than elite accommodation. When analyzing Traoré's warning to Trump, we must appreciate the sophisticated strategic thinking that underlies his approach. This isn't the emotional outburst of an inexperienced leader or the desperate rhetoric of someone seeking to distract from domestic failures. Instead, it represents a calculated assertion of sovereignty principles that challenges the fundamental assumptions governing international relations in Africa. The timing of Traoré's statement is particularly significant. Trump's return to the presidency occurs at a moment when African nations are increasingly asserting their independence from traditional Western partnerships. The withdrawal of French forces from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, the growing influence of alternative partnerships with nations like Russia and Turkey, and the emergence of new economic frameworks that prioritize African agency all contribute to a transformed continental landscape. Traoré's economic vision extends far beyond rhetoric about sovereignty and self-determination. His administration has implemented policies designed to maximize the benefits of Burkina Faso's natural resources for the country's citizens rather than foreign corporations and their local proxies. The renegotiation of mining contracts, the emphasis on local value addition, and the development of indigenous technological capabilities represent practical manifestations of sovereignty principles. The gold mining sector, which contributes significantly to Burkina Faso's export earnings, has been particularly targeted for reform. Traditional arrangements that allowed foreign companies to extract vast quantities of gold while providing minimal benefits to local communities have been replaced with partnerships that prioritize technology transfer, local employment, and community development. This approach demonstrates that sovereignty isn't merely about political independence, but encompasses economic self-determination and resource control. Traoré's agricultural policies reflect a similar commitment to food sovereignty and rural development. Rather than perpetuating the colonial model of cash crop production for export markets, his administration has emphasized diversified agricultural production that prioritizes food security, for Burkinabe citizens while developing sustainable export opportunities. This approach recognizes that true independence requires the ability to feed one's population without dependence on imported food supplies that can be weaponized during periods of political tension. The regional implications of Traoré's stance extend throughout West Africa and across the Sahel region. His leadership has inspired similar movements in neighboring countries, where young people are demanding accountability from their governments and questioning the wisdom of traditional partnerships with former colonial powers. The formation of the Alliance of Sahel States alongside Mali and Niger represents an institutionalization of these sovereignty principles at the regional level. This regional cooperation framework challenges the traditional divide-and-conquer strategies that have historically prevented African nations from developing meaningful partnerships with each other. By coordinating security policies, economic development strategies, and international relations approaches, these nations demonstrate that African unity isn't merely a romantic ideal, but a practical necessity for achieving genuine independence. The security challenges facing the Sahel region provide a compelling case study in the failures of external military intervention and the potential for indigenous solutions. Despite years of French military presence through Operation Serval and Operation Barkhane, security conditions across the region continue to deteriorate. The presence of thousands of foreign troops, sophisticated military equipment, and substantial financial investments failed to address the root causes of instability or provide sustainable security solutions. Traoré's approach to security emphasizes community-based solutions, regional cooperation, and addressing the socio-economic factors that contribute to instability. Rather than relying on foreign military contractors or accepting the permanent presence of external forces, his administration has invested in training local security forces, developing indigenous intelligence capabilities, and creating economic opportunities that provide alternatives to participation in armed groups. The youth dimension of Traoré's appeal cannot be understated when analyzing his significance for continental politics. Africa's demographic profile, with over 60% of the population under 25 years of age, creates unprecedented opportunities for transformative leadership that connects with young people's aspirations for dignity, opportunity, and genuine representation. This demographic dividend has been largely squandered by previous generations of leaders who prioritize personal enrichment and external validation over national development and youth empowerment. Traoré's communication style, his willingness to engage directly with citizens through various media platforms, and his use of local languages alongside French and English demonstrate an understanding of contemporary communication dynamics that resonates powerfully with young Africans. His messages about sovereignty, self-reliance, and African agency spread rapidly across social media platforms, inspiring young people throughout the continent who have grown frustrated with traditional political leadership. The reaction from Western media outlets to Traoré's rise provides illuminating insights into the challenges facing authentic African leadership in the contemporary global information environment. Rather than engaging seriously with his policy proposals or examining the legitimate grievances that brought him to power, many Western publications have focused on concerns about democratic processes, human rights issues, and regional stability. This media treatment reflects deeper assumptions about African political legitimacy and the right of African peoples to determine their own leadership structures. The implicit suggestion that external validation is necessary for African political legitimacy undermines the sovereignty principles that Traoré champions and perpetuates paternalistic attitudes that have characterized Africa's relationship with Western powers for generations. Critical analysis of media coverage reveals patterns of selective emphasis and contextual omission that shape international perceptions of African political developments. Stories about governance challenges in Burkina Faso rarely mention the failures of previous administrations that enjoyed Western support, and discussions of human rights concerns seldom acknowledge the security challenges that have resulted from years of external military intervention and economic exploitation. The economic dimensions of Traoré's conflict with Western powers extend beyond resource extraction to encompass fundamental questions about development models and the role of international financial institutions in African economic governance. The conditions attached to loans from the International Monetary Fund and World Bank have consistently prioritized debt service and structural adjustment over national development and poverty reduction. Traoré's criticism of these arrangements reflects a sophisticated understanding of how conditional lending perpetuates dependency relationships and constrains policy space for African governments. His administration's exploration of alternative financing mechanisms, including partnerships with non-traditional donors and the development of indigenous financial institutions, represents practical steps toward economic sovereignty. The CFA franc currency system, which ties the monetary policies of 14 African nations to French economic interests, exemplifies the subtle mechanisms through which sovereignty can be compromised through seemingly technical arrangements. Traoré's support for monetary independence and the development of alternative regional currency arrangements challenges one of the most enduring legacies of colonial economic control. When examining Trump's likely approach to Africa during his second presidency, we must consider both continuities and changes from his previous term and the broader trajectory of American foreign policy toward the continent. The Trump administration's emphasis on bilateral relationships over multilateral frameworks, its focus on commercial partnerships rather than aid dependency, and its willingness to challenge traditional alliance structures could potentially create opportunities for more equal partnerships with African nations. However, Trump's transactional approach to international relations and his administration's tendency to view Africa primarily through the lens of strategic competition with China and Russia may limit the potential for genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared interests. Traoré's warning reflects an understanding that even well-intentioned American engagement often prioritizes American interests over African development and sovereignty. The broader Pan-African implications of Traoré's stance deserve careful consideration as continental integration efforts continue to evolve through frameworks like the African Continental Free Trade Area and the African Union's Agenda 2063. These initiatives represent opportunities for African nations to reduce their dependence on external powers through expanded intra-African trade, coordinated development policies, and collective bargaining power in international negotiations. Traoré's emphasis on African solutions to African problems aligns with these continental integration objectives, while challenging the assumption that Africa requires external guidance to address its development challenges. His administration's participation in regional organizations and continental initiatives demonstrates that sovereignty principles can coexist with meaningful international cooperation when such cooperation respects African agency and prioritizes African interests. The generational aspect of leadership transformation extends beyond individual countries to encompass continental political dynamics. Young African leaders like Traoré represent a generational cohort that has grown up with digital communications, global awareness, and exposure to diverse development models from around the world. This cohort possesses analytical capabilities and strategic thinking skills that enable them to navigate complex international relationships while maintaining commitment to sovereignty principles. The influence of this generational change extends to civil society organizations, academic institutions, and private sector leaders throughout Africa. Young professionals in various fields increasingly question traditional assumptions about Africa's relationship with global powers and demand policies that prioritize African agency and self-determination. This broader social transformation provides a foundation for political leadership that genuinely represents popular aspirations rather than elite accommodation. Educational investments and technological development represent crucial components of any sustainable sovereignty strategy, and Traoré's administration has emphasized these areas as priorities for national development. The expansion of technical education programs, investments in digital infrastructure, and support for indigenous innovation demonstrate understanding that genuine independence requires technological capabilities and human capital development. These investments challenge the traditional model of African participation in the global economy as suppliers of raw materials and consumers of manufactured goods. By developing indigenous technological capabilities and supporting local innovation, African nations can move up the value chain and capture more benefits from their natural resource endowments, while reducing dependence on imported manufactured goods. The role of African diaspora communities in supporting sovereignty movements deserves recognition, as these communities possess resources, expertise, and international networks that can contribute significantly to continental development efforts. Traoré's engagement with diaspora communities and his appeals for their support reflect understanding that African development requires contributions from all segments of the African family, regardless of geographic location. Diaspora remittances already exceed official development assistance flows to Africa, and diaspora expertise in various professional fields represents an underutilized resource for continental development. Political leaders who successfully mobilize diaspora support while maintaining strong domestic legitimacy can access resources and capabilities that reduce dependence on traditional donors and their conditional assistance programs. Climate change and environmental sustainability represent emerging challenges that require African leadership and innovation rather than external solutions designed for different geographic and economic contexts. Traoré's emphasis on environmental protection and sustainable development reflects understanding that sovereignty includes the right to determine environmental policies and development trajectories that balance economic growth with ecological preservation. The Great Green Wall Initiative, renewable energy development programs, and sustainable agriculture practices represent areas where African innovation and leadership can contribute to global solutions while advancing African interests. Rather than accepting externally designed climate policies that may constrain African development options, leaders like Traoré advocate for African-designed solutions that address environmental challenges while supporting economic growth and poverty reduction. Looking toward the future, Traoré's confrontation with Trump represents more than a diplomatic dispute between two nations. It symbolizes a fundamental shift in global power dynamics and the emergence of a multipolar world order in which African nations assert their rights as equal participants in international relations rather than passive recipients of external direction. This transformation requires sustained commitment from African peoples, continued support for leaders who genuinely serve African interests, and ongoing vigilance against attempts to undermine sovereignty through economic pressure, information warfare, or political interference. The success of authentic African leadership depends ultimately on the active participation of African citizens who demand accountability from their leaders while supporting policies that advance collective African interests. The path forward requires balancing engagement with international partners against protection of sovereignty principles, developing indigenous capabilities while learning from global best practices, and maintaining unity among African nations while respecting their individual characteristics and priorities. Leaders like Traoré demonstrate that these balancing acts are possible when political leadership remains connected to popular aspirations and committed to authentic representation. As we witness this historic moment in African political development, we must recognize our responsibilities as supporters of African sovereignty and self-determination. Every view, every share, every comment on content that truthfully represents African perspectives contributes to challenging the information asymmetries that have distorted global understanding of African political developments. Your engagement with this content represents more than passive consumption of information. It constitutes active participation in the broader movement for African agency and self-determination. By supporting channels that provide authentic African perspectives, you contribute to amplifying African voices and challenging the monopoly that Western media outlets have traditionally held over narratives about African political developments. The algorithms that determine which content reaches large audiences respond to engagement signals like views, likes, shares, and comments. When you actively engage with content that supports African sovereignty and authentic leadership, you help ensure that these perspectives reach broader audiences and contribute to more balanced global conversations about African political developments. Subscribe to this channel to stay informed about the latest developments in African politics and to support continued coverage of sovereignty movements across the continent. Hit the notification bell to ensure you receive updates about new content that provides authentic African perspectives on regional and continental political developments. Share this content with friends, family members, and social media networks to help expand the reach of African voices in global political conversations. Each share contributes to challenging the information monopolies that have traditionally shaped international perceptions of African political developments. Like this video to signal to the algorithm that content supporting African sovereignty deserves broad distribution, and to encourage continued production of similar content. Your likes contribute to the visibility of African perspectives in the digital information ecosystem. Comment below with your thoughts about Traoré's leadership and the broader movement for African sovereignty. Your comments contribute to building communities of people who support authentic African leadership and self-determination, while creating spaces for thoughtful discussion about continental political developments. The future of African sovereignty depends on the active participation of people throughout the continent and in diaspora communities around the world. Your engagement with this content represents a contribution to that broader movement and an investment in the future that young Africans like Ibrahim Traoré are working to create. Together, we can support the emergence of a new era in African politics, characterized by genuine sovereignty, authentic leadership, and meaningful self-determination. The time for external powers to dictate Africa's destiny has passed, and leaders like Traoré represent the vanguard of a continental awakening that will reshape global politics for generations to come. Subscribe now, hit that notification bell, and join the movement for African sovereignty and authentic leadership. The continent's future depends on voices like yours, and every form of engagement contributes to advancing the cause of African self-determination and genuine independence.